Okay, thank you so much for joining us for the webinar, The Business of Rethinking Plastic. We have some excellent presenters today. I'm just going to go over some quick housekeeping. Obviously, this is being recorded, and we are going to be taking questions kind of throughout the webinar. So please put your questions in the chat box, and I will monitor those. And I think that's actually all the housekeeping we have for now. So why don't we start with you, Wendy?
Okay, great. So thanks for everybody for joining us today. Wendy Wendland, I work with Environment America and Public Interest Research Groups. And we have two great experts today to talk about rethinking plastic, particularly in the food service industry. So first up, we have Jonathan Kaplan, who is a sustainability specialist for the Compass Group, which is the largest food service company in the world. And he helps clients reduce their single-use plastic and packaging, among other sustainability goals. And we've asked him today to talk about the Understanding Packaging Scorecard, which he has been instrumental in creating along with a set of other organizations and people that have been involved in this coalition. The scorecard is free, easy to use, web-based tool to assess sustainability impacts of common foodware and food packaging choices. And after we hear from Jonathan, we'll turn to Savannah Seydel, whose company Better Earth provides a particular product to food service companies. And she'll talk about how Better Earth thinks about their role in reducing the use of single-use packaging. So with that, Jonathan, turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Wendy. Perfect intro. It's always weird doing these webinars where you can't see your audience. So I'm gonna be watching the faces of Gabby, Savannah, and Wendy here. So I'm Jonathan. I've been part of this group called the Single-Use Material Decelerator, and it's really a coalition of food service companies and their affiliates and a group of environmental groups and technical experts who got together a few years ago to ask, what could we be doing collaboratively to try to reduce our plastic burden? And one of the issues that came up was sort of bewildering array of choices in the marketplace with all these different green claims. Is recycled content good? Is compostable plastic good? And is reusable really better? Because what about all that water you're using when you have to wash the cups and the energy for heating it, et cetera? So we decided we really wanted a science-based yardstick that we could use to measure all the different options that were out there. And we were particularly focused on reusables, because our instinct was that reusables would be superior to single-use disposable containers. But the problem is that when you go on the internet and start searching, you can find a life cycle assessment to get any answer you want, because when you do those studies, you can determine the outcomes based on the assumptions you make, the scope of the study, the barriers that you put around the study. So it's very hard to get an apples to apples comparison with any option. So we wanted to take the same set of criteria and apply it to lots of different containers. So we created the UP Scorecard. I'm showing you the newest version, which is actually not yet publicly available. I think it's going to get launched next week. So you're getting a sneak preview. If you go to upscorecard.org now, you'll see the current version, which is very close to this, but it's not quite as elegant. So we're gonna go with this one. So what you see here is the landing page. And the most important thing here is that this is set for US data sets. So the tool has just been updated to be globally applicable. So we now have an EU data set in it, but we're just gonna look at US data for today. And then, so you can select your region. We've got the United States picked here, and then you click on the Compare Products button, and you get the next slide. So then you get to choose which container you want to learn about. So we've got cold cups, cold cup lids, hot cups, plates and trays, et cetera, et cetera. So we have multiple materials in each one of these categories. So let's look at cold cups first. So click on that. Next slide. And now you get to decide which cold cups you want to look at. So when you're thinking about a cold beverage, a reusable glass might be a good option. So I've clicked on that one. And then I've selected a polyethylene lined paper cup, a PET, that's a clear plastic cup, and a PLA cup, that's a compostable plastic cup. So then I would click compare and go to the next slide. And you get these scores. So what are we looking at here? So there's a lot going on. There are 6 different metrics that the scorecard uses. There's one for plastic pollution, and that's just a measure really of how much plastic is in that container. And there's a life cycle calculation here about how much plastic could be leaked to the environment based on the mass of plastic in your container there. The next one is chemicals of concern. And this is a really interesting and challenging metric because most of the chemicals that we care about, that we're concerned about, are not disclosed in the product. So we don't actually know which of these hundreds of chemicals might have been used in the manufacture of the containers. So there's some very sort of crude approximations happening here. I think glass and steel get a higher score than paper and plastic. Paper and plastic are much more likely to leach different chemicals of concern than glass or metal. But really, for this to work well, we would want the manufacturer to disclose which chemicals are being used. And to get a higher score on this, you would be able to customize a container. I'll talk about that in a minute, and then indicate which of the many chemicals are not in this product and whether or not that's being third-party verified or just self-reported. So that's chemicals. Climate is pretty straightforward. This is a traditional life cycle assessment of the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of beverage in our cup. So here we see that the PE line paper cup actually has the best score. Water use, same thing. This is a traditional life cycle assessment measure. Sustainable sourcing. This is a measure of really how, if it's a fiber product, how the fiber was grown. Is there a sustainable sourcing certification like FSC certified? Is a sustainable forestry certification? So you would get more points if you had a certification like that. Or if you have more recycled content in your container, you would get more sustainable sourcing points. And then finally, the last one is recoverability. Recoverability is a measure of how likely it is that this material can be collected and recycled or composted into a beneficial product. So here the glass cup gets a perfect score because it's reusable. So we've sort of arbitrarily said that if you're reusing it, that is our ideal recoverability case. And none of these other products are very recoverable in their current form. But as we know, recoverability is really influenced by the infrastructure at the point of use. If you are in a city that has a great municipal composting operation and you've got a compostable cup, your recoverability score might go up a lot. So you see at the top of this screen, you see that little toggle which is on the left saying USA recoverability averages. That means we're just assuming that the user of this container is an average person in the US somewhere. And the average person does not have access to commercial composting. So it's assumed that even if you've got a reusable or a compostable container, it's not going to get any credit for recoverability in this chart. However, we can customize it if we know that, hey, at my campus here in San Francisco, we've got this all dialed in, we've got commercial composting. We can go into the tool and change those settings. So if you go to the next slide, you would hit, customize your recoverability settings in the previous screen, and that takes you here. And then I can toggle, yes, I've got commercial composting. My composter will accept PLA rigid plastic, PLA utensils, PLA film, etc. Those are all compostable plastics. And then I go back, next slide. Actually, I have to do one more thing. Our model does not give you credit for being compostable plastic unless you're certified compostable. So you can go in and you can customize the PLA cup container, and we check the box down below saying, yes, my cup is BPI certified. That's the Bioproducts Institute, which is kind of gold standard for compostability. So now if we go back to our dashboard, next screen, we see that the tool has created a new container. Now we've got 5 here instead of 4. And there's a PLA Cup Custom. That's got our BPI certification, and the recoverability score is now quite a bit higher than it was before. I think it went from like a 1 to a 51. So that's kind of an overview. There's some other cool things that this will do, including enabling you to create your own container. So you could make up your own container. You pick whatever the material is, you put in the weights, the volume, any certifications, and it will give you a score for it. So I should probably stop there and turn it back over to Wendy, but that's the UP scorecard. And this is free for anybody to use. It's designed really for food service. And we are hoping that food service companies will use this to help measure their current inventories and source more sustainably.
Cool. And what's the web address again?
It's upscorecard.org.
Okay, and we'll definitely have time. I'm sure people will have more questions, yeah. But let's go ahead. And I should have said from the start that I had the pleasure of working with Jonathan when he was an advocate. So he's both worked on the outside, helping to pass legislation around more around the toxics issues is what he did with us years ago. So he comes out of the world of advocacy and then has gone on inside to reform the food service industry from the inside, which I love. Okay, so now we're going to switch to Savannah, who comes at this more from the standpoint of an entrepreneur really working to come up with a product that I assume will score well on the scorecard. So Savannah, take it away. And you could tell us a little bit more about where you are and how you came to this too.
Sure. Hey, everybody. It's nice to see so many friendly faces as well as new faces in this conversation. I'm Savannah, and I'm the Vice President of Sustainability at Better Earth. So I work to address mounting environmental issues. That's where my passion lies, as I feel so many of us here are the same. And prior to my work with Better Earth, I actually worked with the film production company Exposure Labs behind films like Chasing Coral and The Social Dilemma, if y'all are familiar with those. But I saw a massive need, just as like what Jonathan was sharing, what we've been sharing earlier, around food service packaging and huge environmental issues that it's causing. And I wanted to be involved. And as Wendy was mentioning, I wanted to be part of that solution and see how we can continue to transition this evolution around food service. So at Better Earth, we are a sustainable plant-based food service packaging company on a mission to make sustainability accessible. And we are headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I'm calling in from today, and really seek to help build the sustainable South along the way, because we know that if we can build the sustainable South, then we can build the country up as well, right? So I'd like to briefly elaborate a little bit more on what we do and the role that we hope to play in this shared vision towards the future of sustainable food service. So this is kind of what we're all navigating right now, right? This massive global plastic pollution crisis. It's incredibly overwhelming. It's causing exacerbating global climate change among deleterious health impacts. We could go on, and it's a system built upon this linear economy, right? Where it's a make, take, waste from a petroleum-based, right? So foundationally, we are using single-use plastic sometimes as quickly as 5 seconds, and then tossing it into a landfill, or otherwise known as away, right, for somebody else to deal with that. That is what's causing these environmental issues. You're beginning to see expansion of sustainable packaging like compostables, but they still only represent about 8% of all of our food service packaging. And then reusables, that incredible data that Jonathan was sharing, that's the vision, right? But it's still a bit of a dream, especially in many different areas in the United States related to food service. But I feel like, as many, like all of y'all here, we want to see this triangle flipped as soon as possible. And so at Better Earth, we envision a regenerative and circular economy where nothing is wasted and everything within that value chain adds value, right? Where reusable and refillable systems are the norm, where compostables offer a plant-based and petroleum-free alternative where single-use items are still needed in some instances, and plastic from recycled content, whenever possible, is used rarely and sparingly. And so at Better Earth, a journey that we've been working on, right, because we are a sustainable packaging provider, and we know that compostables are part of this bridge, but the vision is reusables, right? So this vision here is how we approach what we do and how we anchor our product development. So while today our product line is focused on certified compostable food service packaging, we've been working with experts and students at Georgia Tech, among other universities, for over 2 years to build out what we hope to be an authentic reusable system for the South. So I hope to have more to share on that soon, but it's a journey that we've been really, really excited about. But, you know, along the way and through that journey, we have learned a few different outstanding barriers and opportunities that I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with. I think, you know, it goes without saying that an unfortunate reality right now is that reusable food service systems often require direct advocacy and lobbying to update health codes within different municipalities to support them. Further, restaurant operators, because of the systems that we have, remain incredibly price sensitive on packaging due to tight margins and seeing that packaging as really a sunk cost rather than the marketing and sustainability opportunity that it can be. And lastly, what's really caused this mess in the first place is that our society has become hyper optimized for convenience, which is a really big issue. So while we have our work cut out for us to address these legislative barriers and educate consumers on the value of reusables and how convenient and streamlined they really can be, you know, I know that we can get there. However, I do also feel that single-use items may still have a role to play here. And through that bridge towards where we are today and that vision state that we all want to be at, we want to ensure that that single-use packaging is as sustainable as possible whenever it is used. So wanted to elaborate a little bit more on that. And compostable packaging, Jonathan offered a great introduction. And, you know, I really appreciated all the customization there now is with the single-use packaging database, because it really is variable, because at the end of the day, compostable food service packaging is still an emerging technology. There's still so much growing, and especially on a hyper regionalized basis and on a manufacturing basis. And it is still a single-use item. That, I mean, that is true. So I just want to put that, you know, out there from the beginning. And it is imperfect, but we believe that it really represents a critical bridge in evolution from the legacy petroleum-based chemical-laden packaging of our past to the packaging revolution that we will all be a part of in terms of reusables and a reusable and refillable future. So some of the reasons why we believe that compostables should be a part of that sustainable packaging toolbox is that it really is a regenerative circular solution that when we're composting, it literally mimics and participates in biological cycles. But the coolest part about it is that where recycling, food is a contaminant, right? With compostable packaging, we are able to use that packaging as a vehicle to get more food scraps from landfills and into our compost bins. And when we're using fully compostable solutions, it makes that whole bin experience and waste, streamlined waste systems that much easier, reduces some of that bin anxiety around knowing where to put things where, because you can put all these things into one place, right? And then when we're operating with that system, really limiting the likelihood of non-compostable items ending up in an organic stream. So at the end of the day, compostables are plant-based products made from renewable resources and agricultural byproducts like bamboo and southern switchgrass. And they're grown by farmers like Shane. He's one of the farmers on our team. And switchgrass in and of itself is a native perennial crop, which means that its roots continue to grow and sequester carbon year after year. These root systems have been seen to grow up to 20 feet underground, offering further carbon sequestration. And so at Better Earth alone, we've been able to employ over 180 people with dignified green jobs in the Southeast, including over 60 farmers. And through this program, we're also able to engage that network on the benefits of regenerative farming practices that they can apply across their operations, lending itself to further carbon sequestration and regeneration potential. And since manufacturing is a really big part of that conversation and typical of LCAs, I wanted to elaborate further on the continued efficiencies that we are seeing in the compostable space as well. So as I mentioned, we lean into southern switchgrass and manufacture in the southeastern United States. And here alone, you'll see through this data that the efficiencies that we've been able to do through our technology has dramatically reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, especially compared to wood or deemed to recycled fiber, especially as it relates to energy consumption and water consumption. And I really appreciated, Jonathan already mentioned this, but it's really important when thinking about compostable food service packaging to remember that we need third-party certification. So Jonathan already mentioned this, but BPI, or the Biodegradable Products Institute, and CMA, or Compost Manufacturers Alliance, are two of the biggest third-party certifiers of compostable packaging that make sure it is third-party certified to break down in 90 to 180 days or less. And right, that packaging, it's grown by farmers like Shane, and it supports venues like State Farm Arena here in Atlanta, Georgia. So you'll see in this image, apologies that it's so blurry, but what I love about this is that the compost bin is the biggest one, right? Because all of their food service ware within that environment is compostable. There's a few recyclable items. So the recyclable bin is a little bit smaller. Landfill, the smallest, for some of those miscellaneous like product tags at the Hawk store and things like that. This creates such a streamlined experience for consumers. And when we're operating within that system, it helps divert those scraps and food waste out of our landfills and into compost piles. So if you compare that system to plastics, where food waste, as I mentioned earlier, is considered a major contaminant, and today, at least 1 in every 4 materials at a recycling facility is rejected due to contamination, right? And you know, all of those compostable products that are going into this compost bin, they add value as well. In addition to serving as a vehicle for that rich food waste, that nitrogen that compost pile needs, compostable packaging can serve as a source of carbon in a composting environment, which is often an expensive input for composters. Many composters have to buy a lot of mulch to help blend and balance that pile. So these are just some of the, I wanted to paint a picture kind of, field to fork to field for y'all around what compostable packaging looks like and the role that it can play in that bridge towards that shared vision that we all have towards a reusable and refillable future. So just really looking forward to this conversation together.
Okay, great. So I have a couple of questions to kick us off, and then for sure other people should put your questions in the chat for either Jonathan or Savannah. So on composting, which Savannah is all in on composting, and Jonathan, I know in the scorecard you evaluate composting. So maybe start with Jonathan, what are the various things you're looking for? I mean, you mentioned some of them, the certification, but what are the other things that, rate a high score, where composting really works, I guess is the question. And we know, there's some like limited, cities around the world that have figured out how to actually get the whole community composting. But what is it like when you look at the score that makes for a good composting system?
Well, we simply decided that let me just back up. We took sort of a big picture view and decided that if your product could be recovered by nature to something that's usable by nature, that's a big plus. If your product can be recovered by humans into something that's economically valued, that's a big plus. And if you can do both of those, that's the biggest plus. So if you've got a product that is recoverable, you score higher on our recoverability scale. I think my own take is that compostable plastic is a great solution if you've got an industrial compost facility right there waiting to take it, and you've got a very convincing pathway to get the material into the right waste stream. The problem is that compostable plastic, or at least PLA plastic, is not compostable unless it's in an industrial compost facility. It won't break down in your backyard. If it makes it to the ocean, it will float around for years and break up into smaller bits of plastic. So it's not really a solution unless you've got the composting infrastructure there to support it. I think, did that answer your question, Wendy?
Yeah. And
backyard compostability is really the holy grail. Like, that if we could have that, then we wouldn't worry so much about whether or not it makes it to the right place at the end of life, because we know that it would just degrade in the environment is something that nature can use. But we are starting to see claims of backyard compostable plastics emerge in the marketplace. PHA is a different resin. Savannah could probably tell us a lot about that too. I think that one sounds more hopeful, but so far the applications are pretty limited and it's expensive.
Yeah, so let's go back to Savannah, and then Molly will come. It sounds like you have a question, but so Savannah, what do you, how do you think about it from that perspective? And including, I think the other question for you, I remember when we first talked about composting, is you were saying, local regulations make it actually challenging to get, I think, Jonathan, to the more, some institutional composting, because sometimes it's regulated, if I remember correctly, sometimes it's sort of regulated more like agriculture, and sometimes it's regulated more like manufacturing. So Savannah, talk a little bit about that, some of the challenges just from being a business that's wanting to do this, of what infrastructure do we need?
Absolutely. Yes. So a few distinctions there, as Jonathan mentioned, there's home compostability. I will say that there's not currently a certification for home compostability in the United States yet. There is a European one, but hopefully there will be one soon. Home compostability can be tricky because, your uncle's compost pile from your dad's compost pile from your compost pile might be a little different, right? So always trying to work towards navigating home compostability to the best that we can. But yes, industrial compostable, so certified commercially compostable, that's what you'll often see on the labels for your compostable packaging. And that is where you have the scientific conditions that are perfect, really that high heat system to help support breaking down a wide variety of organics, whether that be compostable packaging to meat and bones, right? Avocado pits and things like that. So you're continuing to see a lot of momentum in this space. You have over 5 states that have brought in organics diversion laws. What I'm most excited about, and what I think will be a really critical lever towards continuing to grow composting infrastructure, is extended producer responsibility bills that put more of that money back on producers like us to help continue to fund and grow infrastructure. So in California and in Colorado, they recently passed really exciting legislation that will help fund continued growth in recycling and composting infrastructure. But to some of the barriers to entry for local composters within different areas, one thing that I think we'll just continue to work on as a country is education. I think there's a bit of NIMBYism, not my backyardism, around composting, because people just think of it as like a smelly thing, when actually it's a farm. I mean, if you go, I don't know, like some of you have videos on, if you've been to a composting site, I mean, it's quiet. If you close your eyes and just smell, it smells like a farm. And it's really exciting to think that we can translate our waste from something like a landfill to something that operates like that. There is different, because of that lack of education on a local level, you see some confusion around what to classify composting as. Is it an agricultural entity in terms of zoning? Is it industrial? Things like that. It is continuing to be worked through. And I'll say in Georgia, Compost Now, who's a partner of ours, who's a composter that we've invested in and in their growth, they work to help address some of the zoning issues in Georgia and have helped kind of pave the way for other commercial composters and community composters within our area, which is really exciting.
And then Molly, before I go to you, can I ask Jonathan one other question on this topic? Is there, like, some of these facilities start sounding like incineration only because they, I don't know, maybe it's the heat, something about heat, or so are there some of these facilities that you would say, from your wearing your big environmental hat, that we don't, we want to avoid?
No, I'm not worried about the environmental impacts of composting facilities. It's nothing like incineration. This is, when we say high temperature, it's still not burning, right? It's way below anything that would combust. But it's not always a pretty place to go visit. And unfortunately, there's a huge amount of contamination in our municipal composting system in particular. We have curbside pickup here in San Francisco, where all my food waste goes into the green bin and that gets picked up and dumped into the city's compost stream, which is great. But I actually went out and looked at our compost facility in the South Bay, and they've got like sneakers and tennis balls and plastic bags and all kinds of garbage in there that just really degrade the value of the compost. And the other problem with our composting with respect to plastics is that some of these plastic products take a long time to break down. So like plastic utensils, which have a lot of plastic in them, can take months. And the composters don't want to sit their piles, they want to turn their piles into product and move on to the next batch. So I think that's an issue too. I think sometimes they are, picky about what kind of compostables they want to accept into their system because they don't want to have to wait for a long time before they can turn the pile. And the certifications are important for that reason too. I've heard composters complain that some of the quote unquote compostable plastics are really not very compostable, and they're looking for that BPI certification to give them more confidence that it's going to actually degrade.
So Chris has put a question in the chat, which I don't know if Savannah and Jonathan, you can see and respond to.
Well, I was going to ask Molly if you had a question.
Oh yeah, sorry, Molly.
It's okay.
Oh, I could have put it in the chat, but yeah, it was just a comment on what Jonathan said. In Santa Barbara, we have a very fancy new anaerobic digester, and they've just let us know that the bioplastics actually take longer than the cycle of the commercial composter. So even though they could potentially be broken down, they still can't because of the cycle time. So I don't know, that's just another complication I just learned of with even though we have access to a big commercial facility now, those still aren't, and it still isn't an option for us, basically.
Yeah, and to jump in there, really appreciate that. And I think around bioplastics in general, yeah, I think one of the things that's scary about that term is it's very vague. And I feel like a lot of even petroleum-based plastics stick bioplastics to their name, causes a lot of confusion. And especially when it comes down to the consumer level, you're just trying to figure out where to put what, and if something's colored green and the compost bin's green, then you'll put it in there. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done to stop greenwashing within this space. As Jonathan mentioned, third-party certifications are critical towards the continued success and expansion of this. And then around PLA in particular, I mentioned earlier.
Can you spell out what those letters are for those of us that don't think about this every second?
Acid. Yeah, polylactic acid. Fermentation of that creates PLA, which is a type of certified commercially compostable bioplastic. And so with PLA, I think it checked a lot of boxes, right? It helped transition us away from petroleum to a plant-based product, which is really good, and help start that commercial composting process. So it can be composted, but it might take a little bit longer. It checks some boxes, but it's not perfect. And so what I'm really excited about is that there's been continued innovations in that space. Obviously, there's a lot of leaning into fiber-based cutlery, which I'm really excited about and I think will be really helpful, birch, bamboo, and things like that. And then also from that bioplastic side, there's all these different incredible companies. Actually, I saw Deanna Cohen on here. Plastic Pollution Coalition just did a fantastic webinar. I highly recommend y'all check it out around new innovations in bioplastics using mycelium, using kelp and seaweed. I loved it. It was actually all women on that webinar too. I thought that was really cool. And those are all certified home compostable using that European certification I was mentioning earlier. So in terms of that transition, right, sustainability is a journey. So I think PLA checks some boxes. It's not perfect, and we're seeing that. And the innovations in that market that are scalable are really exciting as well.
Can either of you give us an example before we go to Chris's question of a company that's, I mean, maybe Jonathan's yours, but something that a consumer-facing company that any of us would have interacted with that is using a product that anybody, thinks is, well, this is pretty good for where we are. I mean, other than obviously bringing our own stuff, that seems like, as you said, Jonathan, from the very start, that's our best. Using less, bringing our own stuff, that's clearly the best. But if you are in a situation using single-use plastic, or single-use food service ware, is there anybody who is doing it well?
Well,
any like fast food company or anything?
Well, lots of companies are using different versions of these products, right? I mean, we've been talking about PLA. We use a lot of PLA containers in our business. Those are pretty widely used in the Bay Area. They say compostable in big letters, and people feel like it's a more sustainable choice, and I think it is. I just don't think it's as sustainable as we need to go, as we've been discussing.
Right. Yeah, which I think we're all agreed. It's a process. It's a transition.
Yeah.
So getting off fossil fuel, we all know that we want to do that. And then I think, Jonathan, your recoverability is a key piece of it, is getting to the point where not only are we not using fossil fuel, but that whatever we're creating we can, it'll degrade. So Chris had a question about the purchasers, the people purchasing, making decisions about what to purchase, and how do we make it easier for them to do the right thing?
He's calling everyone in my industry short of attention span, which may be true. But yeah, it's an excellent question. We can't make this too complicated for people. And I think our tool is not going to be, it's not for everybody, because it does sort of require you to sit down and spend a few minutes to understand some of these nuances. But I think it can be used to create a much simpler guidance for purchasers. I have a client now that's using this to make a set of purchasing criteria for all their containers. And they basically, one person has spent a lot of time with the scorecard tool and come up with sort of a short list of, buy these, don't buy those. And I think that's the kind of directive that's probably going to be more useful for people. But it does require some subjective, decision making. You have to decide, you care about all of our 6 metrics equally? Are you really just focused on reducing plastic? Are you really just focused on reducing carbon? Different people are on slightly different journeys here, and there's a lot of synergy, but there are also some trade-offs, and the scorecard lets you kind of understand that.
Yeah,
I think I forgot to mention it. In the far right column there is just a summary score of all 6 metrics averaged, and we rank them by that summary score. But you could rank them a lot of different ways, depending on what you care about.
I would also add in too, from the purchasing side, that one of the most exciting things that in my experience in engaging what I would consider some of the pretty conservative groups in food service distribution, these are folks that are so leaning on black styrofoam, at least where I am in Georgia. So in terms of the journey. And so what I think is also most important too is consumers raising their voices and legislation. Those are some of the most important tools in our toolbox too towards systemic change. And it's been really exciting to see here in the Southeast how those folks that have for a long time lent into plaque expanded polystyrene, seeing the growing consumer changes and expectations in terms of packaging and legislation that's really giving them that big push in that direction that I think is necessary. So I think those are 2 critical tools that we have as well in terms of this journey and towards that broader vision.
Okay, so it looks like we have a question about reusables and the health codes, because as we know, during COVID, it became harder to bring our own mug, for instance, to the coffee shop. That's changed a lot. I know in my own experience, it's changed back a little bit, but there's still places that are refusing based on the health codes. Does anyone have any experience changing that?
I don't. I really wish I had an army of lawyers to send out into the world to work on this, because it is a crazy system that we live in. County health departments have a lot of power in deciding how all these laws are interpreted at the county level. So we can actually end up with different regulations all around the country. And I'm not a food safety expert, so I'm not able to criticize, but I am skeptical. I feel like, if you take glove use, for example, we have, our industry uses many plastic gloves every year, and they're expected here. If we have people serving food without gloves on, even if they're not even touching the food directly, it's sort of a sign of shabby operating levels or something. It shows that we don't really care. So people expect to see food servers wearing gloves, but you go to Europe and that's not the case at all. In fact, in many European countries, you're allowed to handle ready-to-eat food as long as you wash your hands first. So I'm not convinced that the food is safer here than there. And I think there's a big opportunity for advocates to get into this conversation and make sure that the health departments really have their science right, and that we've got a meaningful policy, and it's not just, you know, eliminating all risk at all costs without substantiating it.
Right. And then I think in the meantime, it's just a advocacy campaign of your local health department to get them to see there's trade-offs here. Deanna?
Hey guys, just based on, you know, all the science that's come out, even just in the last, you know, 5 days about the forever chemicals and chemicals in plastic being linked to smaller testicles. And now yesterday, the release of the research that they're finding microplastics in breast milk. I'm fairly certain that, well, according to our scientific advisors, we're going to start finding plastic and microplastics and microfibers in everything in our bodies. I'm just saying that based on making kind of hopefully an educated guess based on what I've seen so far. And yeah, I'm, you know, it's closing the gap between how we communicate the health impact and at the same time offer people better, you know, good, better, and best choices of what they can be using instead. And I'm also going to just say to all of you guys, and I'm sure you've heard me say stuff like this before, but like after 14 years for me of working on this, I know some of you have worked on it a lot longer. You know, like how do we close that gap? Because I think this is so important. I don't want to scare people. I'm not a fan of that tactic, and yet it's in everything. So
can we go to Janet's question? Ben, we'll come back to you, but because I think it relates to what you're saying. Yeah. Janet is asking in the chat about why are we calling it bioplastics? Aren't we trying not to use plastic at all? And Deanna, it seems like you probably have an opinion about that.
Yeah.
Or Jonathan.
Well, I was just going to say we have been thinking about that, and what we've encouraged a lot of our business members in Plastic Pollution Coalition to do is if they are making something and it is not a formal plastic, to not call it a bioplastic. If it is made out of seaweed, algae, mushroom mycelium, and not having plasticizing additives, chemicals added to it, then do not call it anything remotely near to the word plastic. We kind of need to redefine it. So
Savannah or Jonathan,
I just want to say that I really appreciate that and appreciate you. I kind of think we need to be scaring people a little bit. I think we need to be scaring all of ourselves a little bit, because this is scary stuff. I mean, all of us are here because we're really concerned. I'm concerned. My husband's concerned. I mean, and so I think that we need to continue to do some scaring. And I think that the urgency is there from a health side, from an environment side, from a systemic side. So the urgency, I think, is continuing all of us here to continue to build community around addressing some of these gaps, especially at a legislative level, around continuing to build that infrastructure. But most importantly, kind of going back full circle to your question, Wendy, around addressing barriers to entry, around creating access to reusables. I think that's continuing to be our best bet towards addressing these biggest issues, right? And one of the things that I have found in my personal research around exploring how to deploy this in the Southeast has been that this mental barrier around kind of passing a product through that imaginary wall from consumer to kitchen and back of house. So creating that circular system, there's this fear. We're such a litigious country, and fear this idea of, you know, me bringing in my own container and then it going to the kitchen and causing some issue. Obviously, there's incredible sanitization technologies that we have today in order to create a circular system, but on a municipality by municipality basis, those are some of the biggest hurdles too that we've seen around continuing to expand that type of infrastructure. And so we need to, as a community, address it together. I think that could be a really fun follow-up topic to do a further deep dive into that.
Okay, Ben.
Hello. Yeah, sorry to come in a bit late, but yeah, I can add to this conversation. I am kind of with Savannah that adding a little fear to the mix is probably wise. I work with K through 12 schools trying to get PFAS out of their products. I tell the kids straight up, like, you have some toxic chemicals that you're eating off of 180 school days in the year, and you should talk to the people that are buying this stuff, that you don't want that anymore. And like, that's an effective messaging technique, and it's also one of the ways we can overcome that barrier. It's, if we're talking about the toxics in the foodware, that's a way to, and like, no one can look at this product and be like, I can tell it has PFAS in it because they're not labeled well compared to this one, which doesn't have PFAS in it. And so it's like, it's a good avenue of approach to use the toxic lens to be pushing for better kind of foodware. And like, you know, the BPI will not take items that are over 100 parts per million of the total fluorine. So like, it's kind of a win-win approach if you can use it to push for the foodware. And it's also important to talk about, like, we're training people that they need plastic starting at 5 years old and all the way up to high school. That's another pressure point that we should be approaching. So getting reusables in schools, and the schools eat the lunch every single day, is a really easy, it's not an easy lift, but it's a solid approach to getting us off our addiction to single-use foodware items. So I'll leave it there, but I have lots of stuff I can add.
Okay, thanks. Can I just ask Jonathan to, you when we were prepping for this, were mentioning some of the specific things that you recommend in a food service setting to reduce the use of single-use plastics. Can you talk a little bit about some of those things?
Yeah, sure. Before we go there, though, just to respond to Ben's great points, I just wanted to point out that we can't just make single-use plastic go away effortlessly everywhere. I think, you know, the scorecard is a great way to show how much better the reusables are. But if you are in a building that doesn't have dishwashers, it's tough. You know, it's like, can you get your client to spend tens of millions of dollars to retrofit their kitchens or their snack pantries or whatever to put in all the infrastructure you need to do that? Is sometimes, you know, can be a hard sell. So I do think that we need to have, we're going to need single-use containers in the short term, and we need to have more sustainable options in it, you know, as we get closer to reusables. So in terms of what we can do now and what we are doing now in some of our accounts, certainly switching to bulk beverages makes a lot of sense. Instead of having, you know, plastic bottles of you know, flat water or sparkling water in your refrigerators, you can install taps that allow your guests to just dispense their own drinks into a reusable glass. Same product, no packaging needed. We are introducing different versions of that where you can have flavored beverages, you can do coffee drinks, you could do kombuchas. I mean, there's a lot of options out there, and they're increasing. And then on the snack side, you know, we're trying to pivot towards more bulk-based, bulk served or bulk dispensed snacks. So instead of individual packets of peanuts, could you not have a charismatic looking jar of mixed nuts, you know, on a counter with a scoop, and you could scoop yourself a little scoopful of nuts and put them in a reusable ramekin or a bowl. You know, so that would be the ideal. And then again, there's all kinds of snacks that you can do that with, not just nuts. You can do it with dried fruit and cookies and chocolates and M&Ms and so on. So that's another whole direction to go. And then of course, we're in the cooking business. So, you know, I'm always excited when our teams step up and say, hey, we could actually make the snacks in-house and offer a homemade version, which is going to be fresher, taste better. You know, it's more customized to the guests. And that can work too.
Okay, cool. Okay, we probably have time. What, Gabby, one more question?
Sorry, Wendy, can I just add a thought into what Ben said earlier?
Sure.
Which is, Ben, I mean, I'm really honest, and we're all really honest with kids when we talk to them too. To me, that's not a scare tactic. That's being just direct, like, this is a problem and this has been linked to that. So just to differentiate between the scare tactics and the facts.
Truth. The facts.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I agree, though, with everything that you're all saying, and appreciate all of you and all of your work. So thank you.
So anything else? Any other burning questions?
I just want to out Deanna Cohen as another co-creator of the Up Scorecard. So excited to have you here, Deanna.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay. Oh, link for the scorecard. The address was in the chat earlier.
Yeah, it's in the chat. Yeah.
It's also really simple, you guys. It's just upscorecard.org. Yeah.
So yeah, check it out. And as Jonathan said, what you're seeing on the web today is the not quite new version. By next week, there'll be an updated version, which will be exciting.
Yeah, they're pretty similar, but
I would say, since I work on this with Jonathan, that we also encourage you guys, if you have any ideas, suggestions, ways to improve it, let us know, because this is creating this. The Up Scorecard was a real labor of love between a bunch of entities who don't normally work together. So it was very unusual, and it took a long time to create, and, particularly adding chemicals of concern and looking at plastic pollution, not just as the weight of plastic, because that makes plastic kind of a winner there for being lightweight, but versus the quantity of it. Those were challenging aspects to add to how we calculated it.
And it seems like you could use that in advocacy. I mean, PERG has definitely done campaigns to get, various fast food places or others, or Whole Foods, to, reduce their use of single-use plastic packaging. And it seems like making sure that all of us are using that to, give them the tools, which presumably their purchasing people probably know about and are like hoping nobody else finds out about, but we can elevate that as a tool that they should be using. Janet?
Yeah.
Yes?
I was just going to ask Jonathan, I think I remember seeing that glass was predicated on being used 25 times. And I was just wondering if he could give a little bit of context for that.
yeah, so the scorecard, the way the display works is we always require the user to pick at least one reusable. We decided, since we have your attention, we're just going to make you learn that reusables are better. It picked, I put glass in there in the slide that I showed you. And then there's a default setting for how many times that reusable is used. And that changes the scores. If you use it 25 times, that's not going to be nearly as good as if you use it, 250 times. What's the right number for glass? It's probably more than 25, I'm sure. So that's a pretty conservative number. So I think if we crank that up to like 100 uses or a couple hundred uses, it would improve the scores even more. And the tool, again, lets you customize it. So you can go in and put in whatever number you think is more appropriate to your cup.
Okay, great. So Savannah, Jonathan, any last words?
No, I think the idea that came up today about getting food safety and health departments in this conversation, I think really is one of the big opportunities of our time. They've not been part of this conversation, and they really need to be. We have to get them. They have to understand what the other side of the coin looks like, and we're not the best positioned entity to do that, but you all might be persuasive.
We actually tried to during COVID, and it was really difficult to get a response just because people were focused on COVID.
Other
I
problems.
think that's, but there might be more receptivity now that we're a little bit farther from that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I like that idea. Savannah?
Agreed. Yeah, I think we have our work cut out for us as a group here, some action items, and hope we can have a deeper discussion around how we can advance some of these different things that we discussed, and just appreciated this opportunity to be here with all of y'all today.
And thank you to both Savannah and Jonathan for joining us, and Gabby for taking care of all the tech. And as she noted in the chat, we send out a video or recording of this, so feel free to share that with other people that might have missed it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
Thank you,
all.
guys. Nice to see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.